In the echoing corridors of Jefferson High, a timid freshman girl was about to become the center of a brutal confrontation. What started as an ordinary walk to her locker took a shocking turn when she came face to face with 3 sneering bullies. Blocking her path. Soo-Min Park wasn't your typical quiet honor student. For 10 grueling years, she had trained in the disciplined art of taekwondo, known in Seoul's competitive circuits for her lightning-fast reflexes and unshakable composure. When a towering jock shoved her against the lockers, laughing as her books scattered, Soo-Min had no idea she was stepping into a moment that would define her and shake the entire school. She stood up, calm and unblinking, then moved with precision that would lead to gasps, broken assumptions, and a viral video that no one could ignore. What began as routine hallway harassment would become a campus reckoning. The students of Jefferson High would never be the same after witnessing the quiet girl unleash the storm they never saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in suburban Colorado bit at Sora Kim's cheeks as she stood before the imposing red brick facade of Middleton High School. At 15, she had already perfected the art of making herself small shoulders hunched forward, dark hair falling like a curtain across her face, hands buried deep in the pockets of an oversized gray hoodie that seemed to swallow her petite frame whole. The building loomed before her, its windows gleaming like watchful eyes, and she could hear the din of teenage voices echoing from within. "You sure you don't want me to walk you in?" Aunt Rachel asked from the driver's seat of her Honda Civic, her voice gentle but tinged with worry. Rachel Kim had inherited more than just her sister's daughter 3 months ago. She'd inherited the weight of responsibility for a girl she barely knew, one who carried grief like a stone in her chest. Sor shook her head, not trusting her voice. The last thing she needed was to be seen as the girl who needed her aunt to hold her hand on the first day. She'd learned long ago that showing vulnerability only painted targets on your back, and she had no intention of making herself any more visible than necessary. "Remember what we talked about," Rachel continued, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. "If anything happens, anything at all, you tell me, okay? Or Mrs. Lockley in the English department. She's good people." Sora managed a small nod, though they both knew she had no intention of telling anyone anything. She'd survived worse than high school before. She could do it again. The hallways of Middleton High buzzed with the chaotic energy of teenage hierarchy. Students clustered in their established territories, the athletes near the trophy cases, the theater kids by the auditorium doors, the academic elite claiming the space outside the AP classrooms. Sora moved through it all like a ghost, her sneakers silent against the polished linoleum as she navigated toward her locker. She'd memorized the layout the weekend before during a quiet reconnaissance mission with Rachel, mapping out the fastest routes between classes and identifying the quietest corners where she could disappear between periods. The key to survival, she'd learned from years of being the new girl, was to become invisible until you could read the landscape well enough to avoid the predators. But even ghosts cast shadows, and Sora's had already been noticed. "Look at her," came a voice from near the trophy case, pitched just loud enough to carry, but soft enough to maintain plausible deniability. "Does she own anything that actually fits?" Sora's fingers tightened on her backpack straps, but she kept walking, her breathing steady and controlled. The voice belonged to Lila Carrington, daughter of the school board president, whose perfectly styled blonde hair and designer jeans announced her status as clearly as a crown. Even without looking, Sora could sense the girl's appraising gaze, the way predators sized up potential prey. "Probably shops at Goodwill," added another voice, Jenna Morales, whose sarcastic edge barely concealed her own insecurities. "Did you see her aunt drop her off? That car's older than we are." The third member of their trio, Tamika Brooks, said, "Nothing. But Sora caught her reflection in the trophy case, glass tall, athletic, with the kind of presence that came from someone who'd learned to use her size as both shield and sword. Her silence felt different from the others, more watchful than cruel. Sora reached her locker and worked the combination with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and precise. Around her, the hallway continued its morning ritual of social positioning and territorial marking, but she remained focused on the simple task at hand: books, schedule, disappear. Hey, the voice was quiet, almost tentative, and definitely not part of the commentary she'd been ignoring. Sora glanced up to find a boy about her age standing nearby, his black hair falling across his forehead in a way that suggested he'd given up on styling it. He wore a faded manga t-shirt and carried a sketchbook tucked under his arm. "You're the new girl, right?" he continued when she didn't respond. "I'm Eli Park. I transferred here last year, so I know how it feels to be, well, new." Sora studied his face, searching for signs of mockery or hidden agenda, but found only genuine warmth. His eyes held the same careful watchfulness she recognized in herself, the look of someone who'd learned to read danger in the spaces between words. "Sora," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the first word she'd spoken to another student since arriving in Colorado, and it felt strange on her tongue. "Cool name," Eli said, and his smile was small but real. "If you need help finding anything, I'm usually in the art room during lunch, or the library. Basically anywhere that's not the cafeteria." Before Sora could respond, the first bell rang, and the hallway erupted into controlled chaos as students scattered toward their first periods. Eli gave her a small wave and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sora with the unexpected warmth of human connection and the uncomfortable realization that she might actually want it. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of introductions, syllabus readings, and the careful navigation of seating charts. Sora chose corners and back rows whenever possible, positioning herself where she could observe without being observed. In a P. English, Mrs. Lockley, a woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to see more than they let on, made a point of welcoming her warmly, but didn't force her to participate in the inevitable "tell us about yourself" ritual. By lunch, Sora had successfully maintained her invisibility, but she'd also confirmed what she'd suspected from the moment she'd heard Leela's voice in the hallway. She was being watched, studied, marked out as she sat alone at a table in the corner of the cafeteria, picking at a sandwich she had no appetite for. Sora could feel the weight of those assessing gazes. She'd been in this position before, in other schools, other towns, other lives. The pattern was always the same. The predators identified the weak, the isolated, the different, and then they struck. The difference this time was that Sora Kim wasn't who she appeared to be. Beneath the oversized hoodie and careful stillness lay years of training, discipline, and a promise made to her mother that she'd never broken. She was a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo, with reflexes honed by years of practice and an inner steel forged by loss. But she was also her mother's daughter, taught that true strength came from restraint, not violence. That honor meant protecting others, not proving superiority. That martial arts was about discipline, not domination. As she watched Lila Carrington hold court at the popular table, surrounded by her followers and admirers, Sora made the same choice she'd made in every other school. She would endure. She would stay invisible. She would survive. She had no way of knowing that her decision to remain silent would be interpreted as weakness, or that her stillness would be mistaken for submission. She couldn't foresee that her very presence, quiet, different, unreadable, would be seen as a challenge to be met. The storm was coming, and Sora Kim was walking straight into its path. The harassment began with all the subtlety of a surgical strike, precise, calculated, and designed to leave no evidence. Sora had been at Middleton High for exactly 1 week when Lila Carrington made her first move. It happened during lunch. In the crowded chaos of the cafeteria, where 100 conversations created the perfect cover for cruelty, Sora was carrying her tray toward her usual corner table when someone later, she would remember it as a blur of blonde hair and deliberate motion bumped into her, with just enough force to send her chocolate milk cascading across her books. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." Leela's voice carried across the nearby tables, pitched with exactly the right amount of concern to draw attention. "How clumsy of me." But her eyes, when they met Sora's, held no apology at all. They held the cold calculation of a predator confirming her prey's weakness. Sora said nothing, just grabbed napkins and began sopping up the mess while Lila continued her performance for the gathering crowd. "Here, let me help you with that. I feel just terrible." "It's fine," Sora managed, her voice barely audible above the cafeteria noise. She could feel the weight of stares, the whispered commentary, the way moments like these became currency in the social economy of high school. "Are you sure? Your books look ruined. Maybe you should speak up, more people might notice you're there." The comment hit its mark with surgical precision. Sora's cheeks burned as laughter rippled through the nearby tables, but she kept her head down, focusing on salvaging what she could of her homework. The breathing exercises her mother had taught her came naturally now, in through the nose, out through the mouth, finding stillness in the center of the storm. "Damn, she really is mute." Tamika's voice cut through the noise, loud enough to carry, but casual enough to seem like an observation rather than an attack, like a ninja or something. "Silent but deadly, right?" More laughter. Sora gathered her soggy books and walked away, but she could feel their eyes following her retreat. The first blood had been drawn, and now they knew she wouldn't fight back. The attacks escalated with each passing day, always staying just below the threshold of what teachers would consider actionable. A textbook knocked from her hands in the hallway, comments about her weird clothes that were clearly hand-me-downs. Loud speculation about whether she actually spoke English or just pretended not to understand when people talked to her. "Maybe she's illegal," Jenna suggested one day as Sora passed their table in the library. "Like, maybe that's why she can't talk to anyone. She's afraid of being deported." "That's not how it works." Eli's voice cut through the comment like a blade. He was sitting at a nearby table, his sketchbook open, but his attention focused entirely on the conversation. "And even if it was, that would make you a pretty terrible person for making fun of someone's immigration status." Sora glanced at him, surprised by his intervention. Most students at Middleton had learned that getting involved in Leela's games was a good way to become a target yourself. But Eli's dark eyes held steady defiance, and his pencil was gripped tight enough to snap. "Relax, art boy," Jenna said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "We're just making conversation." "Right," Eli replied, turning back to his drawing. Conversation. Later, as Sora shelved books in the far corner of the library, she found herself studying Eli's profile. He was sketching something with intense concentration, his hair falling across his forehead as he worked. When he finally looked up and caught her watching, he offered a small smile and turned his sketchbook toward her. The drawing was of a phoenix, its wings spread wide, rising from ashes that looked suspiciously like crumpled notebook paper. At the bottom, in careful lettering, he'd written, "Some fires make you stronger." Sora felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest, not the cold discipline she'd cultivated, but something warmer, more dangerous, the possibility of connection. "Do you draw a lot?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I can't sleep," Eli admitted, which is most of the time. "Moving sucks. Being new sucks, but at least we're not alone in it, right?" Before Sora could respond, Mrs. Lockley appeared at their table, her silver hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the library windows. "Miss Kim, I'm glad I found you. I was hoping you might consider joining our poetry circle. We meet Thursday afternoons." Sora's first instinct was to refuse joining activities meant visibility and visibility meant danger. But something in Mrs. Lockley's eyes, the same warmth she'd seen in Eli's, made her hesitate. "I don't really write poetry," she said finally. "Everyone writes poetry," Mrs. Lockley replied with a gentle smile. "Some people just don't know it yet. Besides, you don't have to share anything you don't want to. Sometimes it's enough just to listen." That evening, Sora sat at her desk in the small bedroom Rachel had prepared for her, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Around her, the walls displayed the careful neutrality of a space designed for temporary occupancy. Beige, generic artwork, nothing that spoke to the soul of the person who slept there. She thought about Eli's drawing, about Mrs. Lockley's invitation, about the way Leela's eyes had held no warmth when she'd accidentally spilled that milk. She thought about her mother's voice, speaking in Korean as they practiced forms in their old apartment. "The strongest tree bends with the wind, but it never breaks." Finally, she picked up her pen and began to write. "I live behind glass clear. Enough to see through, thick enough to muffle sound. The world moves around me in shapes and colors, but I am always watching, waiting, learning the language of silence." The words came easier than she'd expected, flowing from some deep place she'd kept locked away since her mother's death. When she finished, she felt lighter somehow, as if she'd set down a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The next day, she slipped the poem into her backpack and, for the first time since arriving at Middleton High, looked forward to something other than the final bell. But as she walked through the hallways, she noticed that the whispers were getting louder, the comments more pointed. Leela and her friends were growing bolder, testing boundaries, pushing to see how far they could go before she'd finally react. They had no idea that their silent target had been learning their patterns, cataloging their weaknesses, preparing for the inevitable moment when restraint would no longer be an option. Ara Kim was still choosing peace, but she was no longer choosing to be helpless. The assault came during fourth period gym class, in the humid confines of the locker room where supervision was minimal and cruelty could flourish in the shadows between metal lockers. Sora was changing into her uniform when she heard the familiar sound of Layla's laughter echoing off the concrete walls. "God, does she ever wash that hoodie?" Jenna's voice carried from the next row of lockers. "I swear she's worn it every day since she got here." "Maybe it's all she has," Tamika replied, but her tone lacked its usual edge. "My mom says some of these families really struggle." "Well, struggling doesn't mean you can't use soap," Lila shot back, her voice sharp enough to cut. "And it definitely doesn't mean you can't learn to speak English properly." Sora's hands stilled on her shoelaces. She'd been speaking English since she was 5, had attended American schools for most of her life, but her accent emerged when she was tired or stressed, a ghost of her mother's voice that she couldn't quite shake. "I heard her talking to that art freak yesterday," Jenna continued. "She sounds like she just got off the boat." The comment hit like a physical blow. Sora closed her eyes, breathing deeply, feeling the familiar fire of anger kindle in her chest. In her mind, she could hear her mother's voice. "Anger is not the enemy, Soria, but it cannot be the master." She finished changing in silence, stuffing her clothes into her locker with mechanical precision. But as she turned to leave, she found her path blocked by Lila's perfectly manicured hand. "Excuse me," Sora said quietly, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Oh, she does speak." Leela's smile was sharp as broken glass. "I was starting to think you were actually mute. Though I guess that would explain why you never stick up for yourself." Sora met her eyes directly for the first time since arriving at Middleton High. "May I please pass?" "So polite," Leela cooed, but she didn't move. "Tell me, do you always let people walk all over you, or is it just because you're too scared to fight back?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sora felt her muscles tense, the familiar readiness of someone who'd trained for combat flowing through her limbs. It would be so easy, a simple wrist grab, a pivot, and Lila would find herself on the ground wondering how she'd gotten there. Instead, Sora stepped sideways, sliding past Lila with fluid grace. "I don't fight," she said simply. "Because you can't," Lila called after her. "Or because you're too pathetic to try." Sora kept walking, but she could feel the fractures spreading through her carefully constructed armor. Each comment, each cruel laugh, each casual act of cruelty was wearing away at the promise she'd made to her mother. The promise that her strength would never be used in anger, never be wielded as a weapon of pride. The breaking point came 20 minutes later, during the chaos of dodgeball, a game that seemed specifically designed to legitimize violence under the guise of physical education. Sora had managed to avoid the worst of it by staying on the periphery, but Tamika had other plans. The ball came at her with the force of a cannonball, aimed not at her body but at her feet. Sora dodged with unconscious grace, her body moving with the kind of fluid precision that came from years of training. But in doing so, she revealed something she'd been trying to hide. She was fast. Faster than anyone had expected. "Whoa!" someone called out from the sidelines. "Did you see that?" Tamika's eyes narrowed and she grabbed another ball. This time, the throw was harder, more direct. Sora evaded again, her movement so smooth it looked almost choreographed. "Stand still," Tamika growled, frustration evident in her voice. "Stop running away." But Sora wasn't running. She was flowing, moving like water around obstacles, her body remembering lessons learned in dojos across the country. For a moment, she felt the familiar joy of movement, the meditation of motion her mother had taught her. Then the third ball caught her shoulder, thrown with enough force to spin her around. She stumbled, fell, and heard Lila's delighted laughter ringing across the gymnasium. "Finally," Lila called out. "I was beginning to think you were some kind of ninja." If only she knew, Sora thought, pushing herself to her feet. If only any of them knew. That afternoon, she found herself in Mrs. Lockley's classroom for the poetry circle, sitting in a circle of mismatched chairs with 5 other students. The teacher had decorated the space with inspirational quotes and artwork from former students, creating an atmosphere that felt safe and creative. "Today, I thought we'd explore the theme of masks," Mrs. Lockley said, her voice gentle but engaged. "The faces we show the world and the ones we keep hidden. Would anyone like to share something they've written?" Sora's hand moved to her backpack, where the poem she'd written the night before waited like a secret. Around the circle, other students shared their work pieces about social media personas, about hiding depression behind smiles, about the pressure to be perfect. When it was her turn, Sora surprised herself by speaking. "I wrote something," she said quietly. "It's not very good." "All first drafts are terrible," Mrs. Lockley said with a smile. "That's what makes them brave." Sora pulled out her paper, hands trembling slightly. The words she'd written in the safety of her bedroom suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. But as she read them aloud, her voice growing stronger with each line, she felt something shift inside her chest. "I live behind glass, clear enough to see through, thick enough to muffle sound. The world moves around me in shapes and colors, but I am always watching, waiting, learning the language of silence." The room was quiet when she finished, but it was the kind of silence that held weight. MEANING. Mrs. Lockley's eyes were bright with understanding, and she saw Eli nodding from across the circle. "That's beautiful, Sora," Mrs. Lockley said finally. "Would you be willing to let me use it in my AP class?" "Anonymously, of course. I think it would spark some wonderful discussions about communication and identity." Sora nodded, feeling exposed but somehow lighter. For the first time since arriving at Middleton High, she'd shared something real, something that came from the deepest part of herself. But as she walked to her locker after the meeting, she found Lila waiting for her, flanked by Jenna and Tamika. The blonde girl's smile was predatory, and Sora felt the familiar tightening of her muscles. "So," Lila said, conversationally, I hear you're quite the poet. Writing about being invisible and all that. How appropriate. Sora's blood ran cold. Someone had told them about the poetry circle, about her poem. The one safe space she'd found was no longer safe. Nothing to say? Lila continued, stepping closer. That's okay. I think you've said enough for one day. As Sora reached for her locker combination, she felt the fractures in her armor spreading wider. The promise she'd made to her mother was becoming harder to keep with each passing day, and she could feel herself approaching a line she'd sworn never to cross. Behind her, Lila's laughter echoed down the hallway like a threat. The storm was building, and Sora Kim was running out of places to hide from it. Soon, very soon, she would have to choose between the peace her mother had taught her to value and the strength she'd inherited from her. The choice between who she'd been and who she was becoming. The question was, when that moment came, would she have the courage to be both? Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The hallway outside the main office buzzed with the familiar chaos of lunch period students rushing to lockers, teachers hurrying to the faculty lounge, the steady hum of teenage conversation echoing off polished floors. Sora Kim moved through it all with practiced invisibility, her arms wrapped around a worn notebook that had become her most precious possession. Inside its pages lay weeks of poetry, sketches, and fragments of thoughts she'd never dared speak aloud. More importantly, tucked between the back pages, was a photograph of her mother in her pristine white dobook, hands positioned in perfect ready stance, her face serene but alert. It was the only picture Sora had managed to save from their old apartment, and she carried it everywhere like a talisman. She was 3 steps from her locker when Tamika Brooks stepped into her path. "Hey, silent girl," Tamika said, her voice carrying that particular mix of boredom and aggression that meant trouble. "Lila wants to talk to you." Sora's grip tightened on her notebook, but she kept her voice level. "I need to get to class." "Class can wait." Tamika's smile was sharp-edged. "Besides, this won't take long." Behind Tamika, Sora could see Lila approaching with her phone already out, recording. The blonde girl's expression was predatory, and Sora felt the familiar cold recognition of a trap closing around her. Students were starting to notice, forming the kind of loose circle that always gathered when conflict was brewing. "I heard you think you're special," Lila said, holding her phone at the perfect angle to capture both their faces. "Writing poetry, acting all mysterious. But we both know what you really are." Sora said nothing, focusing on her breathing the way her mother had taught her. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Find the stillness at the center of the storm. "You're nothing," Lila continued, her voice rising just enough to ensure the growing crowd could hear every word. "Just some scared little girl who can't even speak up for herself. And you know what happens to girls like that." The shove came from behind. Tamika's hands hit Sora's shoulders with brutal force, sending her stumbling forward. Her notebook flew from her hands, pages scattering across the polished floor like fallen leaves. She hit the ground hard, her palms scraping against the linoleum as laughter erupted around her. But it wasn't the fall that broke something inside Sora's chest. It wasn't even the laughter or the way students pulled out their phones to capture her humiliation. It was the sight of her mother's photograph sliding across the floor, the precious image disappearing under the feet of the gathering crowd. Someone stepped on it. The sound of the frame cracking was lost in the noise of teenage voices, but Sora heard it like thunder. She watched, frozen, as the glass spider webbed across her mother's face, fracturing the only piece of home she had left. "Oops," Lila said, zooming in with her phone. "Looks like you dropped something important. Maybe next time you'll be more careful." Sora crawled forward on her hands and knees, gathering the scattered pages of her notebook while students continued to laugh and record. Her poem about living behind glass was crumpled under someone's sneaker. A sketch Eli had admired was torn in half, but it was the broken photograph that made her hands shake as she carefully picked up the pieces. "This is so going on my story," Jenna announced, her own phone capturing every moment of Sora's humiliation. Caption: "When keeping quiet goes wrong. #mute girl," someone else called out. And the hashtag was taken up by other voices. A digital scarlet letter that would follow her through the halls of Middleton High. Eli appeared at her side, dropping to his knees to help gather her scattered belongings. His face was flushed with anger, but his hands were gentle as he collected the torn pages. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "She didn't do anything to you." "Oh, look," Leela cooed, turning her camera on him. "The art. Freak has a crush. How adorable." "Just stop," Eli said, standing with Sora's rescued notebook clutched in his hands. "This isn't funny anymore." "It was never supposed to be funny," Tamika said quietly, something like regret flickering across her face as she watched. Sora carefully placed the broken photograph between the pages of her notebook. "It was supposed to be educational," Leela finished sharply. "Teaching people what happens when they think they're better than everyone else." Sora finally stood, her notebook pressed against her chest like armor. The hallway had gone quiet except for the soft buzz of phone cameras still recording. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see what the quiet girl would do now that she'd been thoroughly broken. Instead of speaking, instead of fighting, instead of giving them the reaction they craved, Sora looked directly into Leela's camera and smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't submissive or grateful, or any of the expressions Lila had been expecting. It was the smile of someone who had just made a decision, someone who had finally found the line they would not allow to be crossed. "Thank you," Sora said clearly, her voice carrying in the sudden silence, "for showing me who you really are." Then she turned and walked away, her spine straight and her head high, leaving behind a hallway full of confused teenagers and one very unsettled bully who suddenly wasn't sure she'd won after all. That night, Sora sat in the garage behind her aunt's house, surrounded by moving boxes that had never been unpacked. The concrete floor was cold beneath her bare feet, but she didn't care. For the first time in months, she was home. She'd found her old dobok buried in a box marked Sora's room, the white fabric soft and familiar in her hands. As she tied the black belt around her waist, a belt she'd earned through years of discipline and dedication, she felt something shift inside her chest. The girl who had crawled across that hallway floor, gathering broken pieces, was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely. The change in Sora Kim was subtle but unmistakable, like the shift in air pressure before a storm. She still arrived at school in her oversized hoodie, still chose the back rows and corner tables, but something fundamental had altered in the way she moved through the world. Her spine was straighter. Her steps were more deliberate. When she met someone's eyes in the hallway, she didn't look away first. "You seem different," Eli observed during their shared study period in the library, his pencil hovering over a sketch of a phoenix rising from flames. "More present, I guess." Sora looked up from the physics homework she'd been completing with mechanical precision. "I'm the same person I've always been." "No," Eli said thoughtfully, studying her face with an artist's eye for detail. "You're not, and that's not necessarily a bad thing." He was right, though Sora wasn't ready to admit it yet. The girl who had made herself small, who had chosen invisibility over confrontation, was still there. But she was no longer the only voice in Sora's head. There was another presence now, one that spoke in her mother's voice and reminded her that strength unused was not virtue, it was waste. The first test came during third period chemistry, when Lila deliberately knocked Sora's textbook off her lab table. It hit the floor with a sharp crack that drew the attention of half the class, but instead of the expected scramble to pick it up, Sora simply looked at Lila with calm, steady eyes. "Excuse me," she said politely. "You dropped my book." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Lila's perfect eyebrows rose slightly, surprised by the direct confrontation, but she quickly recovered her composure. "Did I? How clumsy of me." Her voice carried its usual mocking edge, but there was something else there now, uncertainty. "You should be more careful where you put things." "I should," Sora agreed, her tone conversational. "And you should be more careful how you move through the world. Accidents can happen to anyone. It wasn't a threat, exactly." The words were too quiet, too reasonable for that. But something in the way Sora said them made Lila's smile falter slightly before she recovered, and bent to pick up the book with exaggerated care. "Here you go," she said, placing it on the lab table with deliberate gentleness. "Wouldn't want anything else to get ... broken." The reference to yesterday's photograph was clear, but instead of the flinch Lila expected, Sora simply nodded her thanks and returned to her work. The interaction left Lila unsettled in a way she couldn't quite articulate, like she'd expected to step on solid ground and found quicksand instead. After school, Sora found herself in the garage again, moving through the familiar patterns of Taekwondo forms with increasing fluency. Each kick, each block, each precise movement felt like coming home to herself. The discipline she'd abandoned in grief was returning, and with it, a clarity she hadn't felt since her mother's death. She was in the middle of a complex series when the garage door creaked open and Aunt Rachel appeared, a cup of tea steaming in her hands. "I wondered when you'd find those," Rachel said quietly, settling onto an old lawn chair to watch. "Your mother's last letter mentioned that you'd stopped training. She was worried about you." Sora completed the form before turning to face her aunt, breathing hard but centered. "She made me promise never to use it in anger." "And have you?" Rachel asked. "Used it in anger?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "But I've been thinking about it." Rachel sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Your mother was wise, but she wasn't naive. She knew that sometimes the world forces choices on us that we'd rather not make. The question isn't whether you'll use your training. It's how you'll choose to use it when the time comes." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Rachel said carefully, "that there's a difference between violence and self-respect, between aggression and standing your ground. Your mother taught you restraint, but she also taught you strength. Sometimes the most peaceful choice is to show people that you're not helpless." That evening, as Sora sat at her desk working on homework, she found herself writing again. Not the introspective poetry that had become her outlet, but something else, a letter to her mother that she would never send, but needed to write. "Eomma." She began, using the Korean word that felt like home on her tongue. "I broke the photograph. But I think you would understand. Sometimes things have to break before they can be made stronger. I haven't forgotten what you taught me about peace, about choosing the gentle path. But I think I'm finally understanding what you meant when you said that true strength protects the innocent. I was trying so hard to be gentle that I forgot I was innocent too. I don't want to fight, but I don't want to hide anymore either. Is it possible to be both strong and peaceful? Can I honor what you taught me while still honoring myself?" She paused, her pen hovering over the paper as she searched for the right words. "I think you would tell me that the answer isn't in the techniques you taught me, but in the heart you helped me develop. The forms are just movements. It's the intention behind them that makes them art or violence, protection or aggression. Tomorrow, I think things might change. I can feel it coming, like thunder before lightning. But I'm not afraid anymore. I'm ready." She signed the letter with her Korean name, the one her mother had given her, the one that meant soaring, and it always felt too big for the quiet girl she'd become. But maybe, she thought as she folded the paper carefully and placed it in her notebook, it was time to grow into it. Outside her window, the Colorado night was clear and cold, stars sharp as pinpricks against the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of wind chimes singing in the breeze, a gentle sound that reminded her of temple bells and morning practice sessions with her mother. Sora. Kim closed her eyes and centered herself, feeling the familiar calm that came from perfect balance between strength and serenity. Tomorrow would bring what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, she was exactly who she was meant to be. The setup was almost elegant in its cruelty. Leela had spent the morning spreading word through the school's social networks that the mute girl had finally found her voice and would be auditioning for the spring talent show in the main hallway during lunch. Of course, there was no talent show, no audition, and no invitation, just a carefully orchestrated trap designed to humiliate Sora in front of the largest possible audience. Sora knew it was a trap the moment Jenna approached her locker with an artificially bright smile and told her about the amazing opportunity to showcase her poetry. She'd watched enough Predators to recognize the signs, the false enthusiasm, the too casual delivery, the way Jenna's eyes kept darting toward the main hallway where Lila was already setting up her ambush. But instead of avoiding the trap, Sora made a choice that surprised even herself. She decided to walk straight into it. "That sounds wonderful," she told Jenna calmly, closing her locker with deliberate care. "Thank you for letting me know." Jenna blinked, clearly thrown by the lack of suspicion or fear. "Oh, great. So you single quotes you'll be there?" "Of course," Sora said, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "I wouldn't want to miss such an opportunity." As Jenna hurried away to report back to Lila, Sora pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to Eli. "Main hallway, lunch period. Bring your camera." The main hallway at Middleton High was a cathedral of adolescent ambition, its walls lined with trophy cases and honor roll plaques that caught the light streaming through tall windows. During lunch period, it became a thoroughfare for students moving between the cafeteria and outdoor seating areas, making it the perfect stage for public drama. Sora arrived to find exactly what she'd expected, Leela holding court near the trophy cases with her phone already recording, Tamika and Jenna flanking her like bodyguards, and a growing crowd of students who sensed that something interesting was about to happen. "Oh look," Lila announced loudly as Sora approached. "Our star performer has arrived. I hope you're ready to show everyone what you're really made of." The circle of students tightened, phones appearing as if by magic. Sora found herself at the center of a digital coliseum, surrounded by cameras hungry for content and teenagers eager for entertainment at someone else's expense. "I understand there's a talent show audition?" Sora said clearly, her voice carrying in the sudden hush that had fallen over the crowd. Leela's smile was sharp as a blade. "Oh yes, absolutely. We're all so eager to see what hidden talents you've been keeping from us. Don't be shy now, show us what you can do." The mockery in her voice was unmistakable, and nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. This was the moment where the quiet girl was supposed to realize she'd been duped, where humiliation would crash over her like a wave and send her fleeing in tears. Instead, Sora nodded thoughtfully and took a step back, creating space around herself with unconscious authority. "You want to see what I can do?" she said, her voice calm but somehow commanding. "Are you sure about that?" Something in her tone made Leela's smile waver slightly. "Of course. We're all waiting." Sora closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself the way her mother had taught her. When she opened them again, the girl who had spent weeks making herself invisible was gone, replaced by someone who commanded attention without demanding it. She moved into a basic ready stance, feet shoulder-width apart, hands relaxed at her sides, spine perfectly straight. To most of the watching students, it looked like nothing more than standing still. But to anyone who knew martial arts, the shift was unmistakable. "What's she doing?" Someone whispered. Tamika, apparently deciding that whatever was happening had gone on long enough, stepped forward aggressively. Stop being weird and just, she reached out to shove Sora. The same brutal push that had sent her sprawling across the hallway floor just days before. But this time, Sora was ready. The movement was almost too fast to follow. One moment Tamika's hands were reaching for Sora's shoulders, and the next she was on the ground, staring up at the ceiling in shock while Sora stood exactly where she'd been before, barely seeming to have moved at all. The hallway erupted in gasps and confused shouts, but Sora remained perfectly still, her breathing calm and controlled. She hadn't struck Tamika, hadn't hurt her, she'd simply redirected the girl's own momentum, using her aggression against her with surgical precision. "How did you?" Tamika started to say, but Sora was already speaking, her voice carrying clearly over the noise of the crowd. "This isn't the kind of strength you understand yet," she said, looking down at Tamika with something that might have been compassion, but it could be if you wanted to learn. She offered her hand to help Tamika up, and after a moment's hesitation, the taller girl took it. As Sora pulled her to her feet with easy strength, Tamika's expression shifted from anger to something approaching awe. "You're not who I thought you were," Tamika said quietly. "No," Sora agreed. "I'm not." The crowd was buzzing now, phones capturing every moment as the story shifted from bullying spectacle to something else entirely. Layla, realizing that her carefully orchestrated humiliation had backfired spectacularly, tried to regain control of the narrative. "So what, you know some karate moves?" she said loudly, her voice pitched with false bravado. "That doesn't make you special, it just makes you dangerous." Sora turned to look at her, and for the first time since arriving at Middleton. "Hi," she smiled, really smiled, with genuine warmth and confidence. "You're right," she said. "It does make me dangerous, but not in the way you think." She gestured to the crowd around them, to the phones recording everything, to the students who were looking at her with new eyes. "I'm dangerous to the idea that quiet people are weak, that different means less than. That silence is the same as surrender." Her voice grew stronger with each word, carrying the authority of someone who had finally found their truth. "I'm dangerous to bullies who think they can define other people's worth." The hallway had gone completely silent now, even Layla's phone hanging forgotten in her hand. Sora looked around at the faces surrounding her, some shocked, some admiring, some calculating the shift in social dynamics that was happening in real time. "My name is Sora Kim," she said clearly. "I'm a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo. I speak 3 languages fluently. I write poetry, and I've been in more schools than most of you have visited cities. I'm not mute, I'm not weak, and I'm not going anywhere." She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the final blow with quiet devastation. "And Layla?" There was never going to be a talent show audition, was there? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and suddenly every phone in the hallway was pointed at Layla instead of Sora. The trap had been perfectly reversed, and now it was the predator who stood exposed in the digital spotlight. That's not," Layla stammered, her composure finally cracking as she realized how completely the tables had turned. But Sora was already walking away, her head high and her steps confident. As she moved through the crowd, students parted before her with something approaching respect, and she could hear the whispered conversations beginning behind her. "Did you see how fast she moved? She's been hiding that this whole time. I felt bad for her before, but now damn." By the time Sora reached her locker, Eli was waiting for her with his camera and a grin that threatened to split his face in half. "That," he said breathlessly, "was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And I got every second of it." Sora looked at him, this boy who had stood by her when she was nothing more than a target, who had seen her potential before she'd remembered it herself. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." As the lunch bell rang and students began moving toward their next classes, Sora Kim walked through the halls of Middleton High as herself for the first time, no longer invisible, no longer silent, no longer afraid. The quiet girl was gone. In her place walked someone stronger, someone who had learned that true power came not from avoiding conflict, but from choosing your battles wisely and fighting them with honor. The video went viral within the hour. Eli had edited with the skill of someone who understood narrative, opening with Tamika's aggressive approach, capturing the fluid moment of Sora's defense, and ending with her declaration of identity. But it was the audio that made it truly powerful. Sora's calm voice explaining that she was dangerous to the idea that quiet people are weak had already been turned into memes, shared across social platforms, and picked up by accounts dedicated to anti-bullying content. By the time the final bell rang, #QuietStrength was trending locally, and the video had thousands of views. Principal Hartwell summoned Sora to his office immediately after school, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of concern as he gestured for her to sit across from his imposing oak desk. The office walls were lined with certificates and photos documenting his 30-year career in education, but nothing had prepared him for the viral sensation currently disrupting his carefully managed school environment. "Miss Kim," he began, adjusting his tie with nervous precision, "I think we need to discuss what happened during lunch period today." Sora sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, meeting his gaze with the same calm she'd shown in the hallway. "Yes, sir. What would you like to know?" "Well, for starters, I'd like to know why you didn't report the bullying you'd apparently been experiencing. Our school has a strict anti-bullying policy, and there are proper channels for these complaints. I wasn't aware that being pushed down in a hallway full of witnesses required a formal complaint," Sora replied evenly. The incident seemed fairly well documented. Principal Hartwell shifted uncomfortably. "That's not the point. The point is that we have a zero-tolerance policy regarding physical altercations, and what I saw on that video could be interpreted as self-defense," Sora interrupted quietly. "What you saw was self-defense. I didn't strike anyone. I didn't initiate contact. I simply prevented someone from pushing me down again. Nevertheless, the school board is very concerned about liability issues. If students believe they can take matters into their own hands, with respect, Principal Hartwell," Sora said, her voice gaining strength, "students have been taking matters into their own hands for weeks. The difference is that now one of them knows how to protect herself." The principal rubbed his temples, clearly struggling with a situation that his administrative training hadn't covered. "Miss Kim, I understand you've been through a difficult transition, and I sympathize with the challenges you've faced. But encouraging vigilante justice, I'm not encouraging anything," Sora said firmly. "I'm simply refusing to be victimized. There's a difference." Before Principal Hartwell could respond, there was a knock on his office door. Mrs. Lockley entered without waiting for permission, her silver hair slightly disheveled and her usually mild expression showing uncharacteristic steel. "Principal Hartwell," she said briskly, "I hope you're not planning to punish Miss Kim for defending herself after weeks of harassment that your office failed to address. Mrs. Lockley, this is a private disciplinary meeting, which is exactly why I'm here." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through what appeared to be a very long list. "Because I have documentation of 17 separate incidents of bullying directed at Miss Kim that were reported to various staff members over the past month. 17 incidents that resulted in 0 administrative action." Principal Hartwell's face went pale. I wasn't made aware of any formal complaints." "Because she didn't file formal complaints," Mrs. Lockley said sharply. "She did what most students do. She tried to handle it quietly, hoped it would stop, and trusted that the adults in charge would notice when a child was being systematically tormented. We failed her, Principal Hartwell. The question now is whether we're going to compound that failure by punishing her for our inadequacy." Sora watched the exchange with growing amazement. She'd known Mrs. Lockley cared about her students, but seeing the English teacher go to war on her behalf was both humbling and empowering. Furthermore, Mrs. Lockley continued, that video has been viewed over 50,000 times in the past 3 hours. Local news stations are calling, the district office is fielding calls from parents, and the school board is going to want answers. Do you really want those answers to include the fact that you attempted to punish the victim? The principal was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly on his desk as he processed the implications. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully measured. Miss Kim, I want to be clear that the school does not condone violence in any form. However, after reviewing the circumstances and consulting with staff members who witnessed the ongoing harassment, I'm satisfied that your actions fell within the bounds of reasonable self-defense. Sora nodded gravely. Thank you, Principal Hartwell. However, he continued, I would strongly encourage you to report any future incidents through proper channels, and perhaps you might consider channeling your obvious talents in a more constructive direction. I understand Mrs. Lockley has proposed starting a self-defense club. I have, Mrs. Lockley confirmed, with Miss Kim as student coordinator, assuming she's interested. Sora looked between the two adults, feeling the weight of opportunity settling on her shoulders. I'd be honored, she said quietly as they left. The principal's office, Mrs. Lockley fell into step beside Sora, her expression softening into something approaching maternal pride. You know, the teacher said conversationally, when I first read your poetry, I knew you had a powerful voice. I just didn't realize how powerful. I'm still learning, Sora admitted. This morning I was terrified of being seen. Now I feel like the whole world is watching. They are, Mrs. Lockley said with a smile. The question is, what do you want them to see? They were interrupted by the sound of running footsteps in the hallway behind them. Eli appeared, slightly out of breath and grinning widely, his camera bag bouncing against his hip. Sora, he called out. You need to see this. He pulled out his phone and showed her the screen, where notifications were scrolling past faster than she could read them. Comments, shares, reactions, all responding to the video that had captured her moment of truth. Look at some of these messages, he said, scrolling to show her specific comments. This gave me the courage to stand up to my own bullies. Quiet. Strength is real strength. Thank you for showing us that being different isn't being less. Sora stared at the screen, overwhelmed by the realization that her private moment of self-defense had become something larger, something that resonated with people she'd never met who were fighting their own battles against those who tried to diminish them. I never meant for it to go this far, she said softly. The best revolutions never do, Mrs. Lockley observed. They start with one person deciding they've had enough and refusing to stay silent. The rest of us just follow their lead. As they walked toward the parking lot where Aunt Rachel was waiting, Sora felt the full weight of what had changed in the space of a single lunch period. The quiet girl who had arrived at Middleton High hoping only to survive was gone, replaced by someone who had found her voice and discovered that it carried farther than she'd ever imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new expectations, new responsibilities. But tonight, for the first time since her mother's death, Sora Kim felt like she was exactly where she belonged, standing tall, speaking truth, and using her strength not to dominate others, but to lift them up. The revolution had begun with a single moment of refusing to fall. Where it would lead, none of them could say. But they would face it together, and that made all the difference. The fracture in Lila's world began at 7:23 a.m., 2 days after the video went viral, when she walked into Middleton High to find students clustering around their phones, watching her public humiliation on repeat. The whispers followed her down the hallway like shadows, not the respectful murmurs of social status she was accustomed to, but something else entirely. Curiosity, judgment, pity. By second period, the crown she'd worn so carefully had cracked beyond repair. "This is insane," she said to Jenna as they stood at their usual spot by the trophy cases, the same location where her carefully orchestrated trap had backfired so spectacularly. "It's like everyone's forgotten who I am." Jenna shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting away from Layla's intense gaze. Over the past 2 days, she'd watched the social media storm with growing unease, seeing the comments that called Leela cruel, manipulative, a textbook bully. More disturbing was how accurate those comments felt. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing," Jenna said quietly. "Excuse me?" Leela's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who wasn't used to being contradicted by her closest allies. "I said maybe that's not such a bad thing," Jenna repeated, her voice gaining strength. "When was the last time someone looked at you and saw something other than someone to be afraid of? When did you last have a conversation that wasn't about who to target next or which social ladder to climb?" Leela stared at her former friend, apparently with something approaching shock. "I can't believe you're turning on me too. After everything I've done for you." "What have you done for me, exactly?" Jenna asked, her years of suppressed thoughts finally finding voice. "Taught me how to hurt people before they could hurt me. Shown me how to make myself feel bigger by making others feel small. Because if that's friendship, Layla, I don't want it anymore." The words hung in the air between them like a severed bridge. Leela felt something cold and unfamiliar twist in her stomach, the recognition that she was truly alone for the first time since elementary school. "Fine," she said, her voice brittle with forced indifference. "Go ahead and abandon me like everyone else. See how long your principles last when you're sitting by yourself at lunch." But Jenna was already walking away, her shoulders set with newfound determination. As Lila watched her leave, she caught sight of Tamika approaching from the opposite direction, and for a moment felt a flicker of hope that at least one ally remained. That hope died when she saw Tamika's expression. "We need to talk," Tamika said without preamble, her usual aggressive confidence replaced by something more thoughtful, more uncertain. "If you're here to lecture me about my choices, save it," Lila said defensively. "I've heard enough moral superiority for one day." "Actually," Tamika said, "I'm here to ask you something. When you decided to target Sora, what were you hoping to accomplish?" The question caught Lila off guard. She'd expected anger, accusations, another defection, not genuine curiosity about her motivations. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "Carefully, I mean, what was the endgame? You saw a quiet girl who kept to herself, bothered no one, minded her own business. And you decided that she needed to be what? Broken? Humiliated? Made to feel as small as possible?" Tamika's voice held no accusation, just confusion. "I keep trying to understand why that felt necessary." Leela opened her mouth to defend herself, to explain about social hierarchies and natural selection and the way the world really worked. But under Tamika's steady gaze, all those rationalizations crumbled into dust. "She made me feel invisible," Leela said finally, the words coming out smaller than she'd intended. "Not because she tried to, but because she didn't try not to. She didn't care about our rules, our games, our social order. She existed completely outside of everything I thought mattered, and that made me question whether any of it actually did matter." Tamika nodded slowly, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "So you tried to force her into your world by breaking her, and when that didn't work, when she showed you that there were other kinds of strength than the ones you understood, you felt even more threatened." "I'm not threatened by her," Lila said automatically, but the protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. "I was," Tamika admitted. "When she put me on the ground without breaking a sweat, without even seeming to try, I realized how much of my identity was built on being physically intimidating. And you know what? It was terrifying and liberating at the same time." She paused, studying Leela's face with an intensity that made the blonde girl want to look away. I'm going to her self-defense class tomorrow, Tamika continued. Not because I want to learn how to hurt people, but because I want to learn how to be strong without needing to make others weak. You should think about coming too. Why would I want to do that? Leela asked, but there was less venom in the question than there had been minutes before. Because, Tamika said gently, I think you're as tired of being who you've been as the rest of us are. And maybe it's time to find out who you could be instead. After Tamika left, Lila stood alone in the hallway that had once been her kingdom, watching students flow around her like water around a stone. For the first time in years, no one seemed to notice her presence, and the invisibility she'd always feared felt less like a punishment and more like an opportunity. That afternoon, she found herself walking toward the English wing, where Mrs. Lockley was setting up chairs in a circle for the newly formed poetry and expression group, a safe space for students to share their thoughts and feelings without judgment. She paused in the doorway, watching as Sora helped arrange the chairs. With quiet efficiency, the Korean girl looked up and their eyes met across the room, and instead of the triumph or contempt Lila expected to see, she found only calm acknowledgement. There's an empty chair if you'd like to join us, Sora said simply. Everyone's welcome. Here, Layla hesitated on the threshold, caught between the person she'd been and the person she might become. The choice felt impossibly large and simultaneously simple: step forward into uncertainty, or remain frozen in a role that no longer fit. She took a step forward. 3 weeks later, Leela found Sora in the school courtyard during the quiet hour. After classes ended, sitting beneath an old oak tree with a notebook open in her lap. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the pages where Sora was writing with focused concentration. May I sit down? Leela asked, her voice careful and uncertain in a way that would have been unrecognizable to the students who'd once feared her sharp tongue. Sora looked up from her writing, studying Leela's face for a moment before nodding toward the grass beside her. Of course. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of everything that had passed between them settling around them like autumn leaves. Lila picked at the grass with nervous fingers, searching for words that felt adequate to the moment. I've been coming to the poetry group, she said finally. And the self-defense club. I know, Sora replied quietly. You're a good student. Tamika says you have natural balance. I'm not very good at the poetry part yet, Leela admitted with a self-deprecating smile. Turns out it's harder to build something beautiful than it is to tear it down. Sora closed her notebook and turned to face Lila fully, her dark eyes holding the same calm attention that had become her trademark. Is that what you came here to talk about, poetry? Lila shook her head, feeling tears threaten at the edges of her vision. The careful composure she'd maintained for weeks suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. I came to apologize, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not because Mrs. Lockley suggested it, or because it might improve my social standing, or because I want something from you. I came because I need you to know that I understand now. What I did to you, what I tried to make you become, it was unforgivable. Sora listened without interrupting, her expression neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply present in the way that made people feel both exposed and safe. I told myself it was about maintaining order, about teaching you how the world worked, Lila continued, the words coming faster now as if she needed to get them all out before she lost her courage. But the truth is, I was terrified of you from the moment you walked into our school. Terrified of me. Sora's eyebrows rose slightly. Why? Because you didn't need us, Leela said simply. You didn't need our approval, our acceptance, our validation. You existed completely independently of everything I thought gave life meaning. And if you could be okay, more than okay, if you could be strong and dignified and complete, without any of the things I'd spent my whole life chasing, then what did that say about me? She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, not caring if it smudged her carefully applied makeup. So I tried to break you. I tried to force you to need what I needed, to want what I wanted, to be as small and scared and dependent as I was. Underneath all the performance. And when that didn't work, when you just kept being yourself no matter what I did to you, I got desperate. Sora was quiet for a long moment, watching a small bird hop between the roots of the oak tree. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. I wasn't strong because I didn't need people, she said. I was strong because I knew the difference between needing people and needing their approval. I needed connection. Friendship, belonging, but I didn't need to diminish myself to get them. And I did, Lila said, understanding. I made myself smaller by making others smaller. I confused power with strength, control with confidence. We both made mistakes, Sora said gently. You hurt me, yes. But I also let my grief and fear make me invisible when I could have been present. I could have spoken up sooner, trusted that. There were adults who would help, believed that I deserved to take up space in the world. Layla stared at her, amazed by the generosity of spirit that could find shared responsibility in what had seemed like clear-cut victimization. How can you forgive me? She asked. After everything I put you through? Sora smiled, and for the first time since their confrontation in the hallway, it was the warm, genuine expression of someone who had found peace with herself and her choices. Because holding on to anger would make me smaller, she said. And because I've learned that forgiveness isn't about pretending that hurt didn't happen. It's about refusing to let that hurt define what happens next. She paused, studying Lila's face with the same careful attention she'd once reserved for potential threats. But mostly, I forgive you because I can see who you're becoming, and she's someone worth knowing. They sat together under the oak tree. As the shadows lengthened and the school emptied around them, two girls who had found their way from conflict to understanding, from performance to authenticity. The path hadn't been easy, and there would be more challenges ahead, but they had learned something invaluable. That true strength came not from being invulnerable, but from choosing vulnerability when it served something larger than fear. When they finally stood to leave, Leela turned back one more time. Sora, thank you for showing me what real strength looks like, and for giving me the chance to become someone I can actually respect. As they walked toward the parking lot together, not as friends yet, perhaps, but no longer as enemies, Sora felt her mother's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder, approving not just of her forgiveness, but of her courage to remain open to the possibility that people could change, grow, and become better than they had been. The spring assembly at Middleton High was typically a forgettable affair: academic awards, spring sports announcements, and the usual administrative reminders about testing schedules and summer reading lists. But this year, Principal Hartwell had added something unprecedented to the agenda: a student speaker whose story had transformed not just her own life, but the culture of their entire school. Sora Kim stood backstage in the auditorium, her hands steady despite the butterflies dancing in her stomach. Through the heavy curtains, she could hear the rustle and murmur of 800 students settling into their seats, teachers patrolling the aisles, and the squeal of microphone feedback as the sound crew made final adjustments. 6 months ago, the thought of standing before such a crowd would have sent her fleeing to the nearest exit. Now she adjusted the small microphone clipped to her collar and reviewed her notes one final time. She felt something she hadn't experienced since her mother's death, the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and being proud of that person. You ready for this? Eli asked, appearing at her elbow with his camera bag slung over his shoulder. As the official student documentarian for the assembly, he'd been given permission to film her speech for the school's archives and for the growing collection of anti-bullying resources that had sprung up around their story. As ready as anyone can be to bare their soul to 800 teenagers, Sora replied with a smile that held only the slightest tremor of nervousness. From the wings, she could see Aunt Rachel in the audience, sitting in the front row reserved for family members. Her aunt's eyes were already bright with unshed tears of pride, and she gave Sora an encouraging thumbs up when their gazes met. Mrs. Lockley approached from the opposite wing, her silver hair gleaming under the stage lights and her expression radiating the fierce pride of a teacher whose student was about to soar. "Remember," she said softly, "you're not speaking to 800 people. You're speaking to 800 individuals, each of whom has felt invisible or misunderstood, or different at some point in their lives. You're giving them permission to be proud of who they are." Principal Hartwell's voice echoed through the auditorium as he began his introduction, and Sora felt the familiar calm settle over her, the same centered stillness she'd found in martial arts, in poetry, in the moments when she'd chosen courage over comfort. "Ladies and gentlemen, students and faculty, I'd like to introduce someone who has taught our entire school community about the power of quiet strength, the importance of standing up for ourselves and others, and the beautiful truth that being different is not the same as being less. Please welcome Sora Kim." The applause that greeted her as she walked onto the stage was warm and sustained, but what struck her most was the quality of attention in the room. These weren't bored teenagers waiting for assembly to end. They were young people who had watched her journey, who had been changed by her example, and who were genuinely curious about what she had to say. Sora approached the podium with the same deliberate grace she brought to everything, adjusted the microphone to her height, and looked out over the sea of faces. In the middle section, she spotted Tamika sitting with members of the self-defense club they'd built together. Near the back, Jenna waved from her seat with the poetry group. And in the fifth row, Lila sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap and her attention completely focused on the stage. 6 months ago, Sora began, her voice clear and steady, I walked into this school believing that the safest way to exist was to make myself invisible. I thought that if I was quiet enough, small enough, unobtrusive enough, I could avoid conflict and simply survive until graduation. She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the audience, connecting with individual faces. I was wrong. Not because invisibility's inherently bad sometimes. We all need space to figure out who we are, but because I wasn't choosing invisibility. I was choosing erasure. I was allowing other people's perception of my worth to become my reality, and in doing so, I was betraying everything my mother had taught me about strength, dignity, and the responsibility we have to honor our own truth. The auditorium was completely silent now, 800 teenagers and dozens of adults hanging on every word. My mother was a Taekwondo master, Sora continued, and she could see some students sit up straighter as they recognized the connection to the viral video that had started everything. She taught me that martial arts wasn't about fighting, it was about balance. Physical balance, emotional balance, and the balance between strength and restraint, between confidence and humility, between protecting yourself and protecting others. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, carefully repaired photograph, the same image of her mother that had been trampled in the hallway months before. The frame was new, but the cracks in the glass remained, creating a spider web pattern across her mother's serene face. This picture was broken during one of the incidents that led to my moment of standing up for myself. I could have replaced. The glass made it look perfect again. But I kept the cracks because they remind me that sometimes things have to break before they can become truly strong. Sometimes we have to shatter our old ideas about ourselves before we can build something better. She set the photograph on the podium where everyone could see it, a visual representation of the journey from brokenness to wholeness. I want to talk to every person in this auditorium who has ever felt invisible, different, or less than. You are not too quiet, too weird, too sensitive, too different, or too anything. You are exactly who you're supposed to be, and the world needs your particular brand of strength, wisdom, and beauty. Don't let anyone convince you that you need to Diminish yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed for someone like you. Instead, trust that your uniqueness is not a flaw to be hidden, but a gift to be shared. The applause was immediate and thunderous, but Sora raised her hand gently, indicating she wasn't finished. I also want to speak to everyone who has ever used their power to make others feel small. I understand that impulse, now the fear that drives us to tear others down in order to feel secure in our own worth. But I've learned something important. There's enough room in this world for all of us to shine. Your light doesn't become dimmer when someone else's burns brightly. In fact, when we support each other, when we celebrate our differences instead of punishing them, we all become more luminous. She looked directly at Lila, who was wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. Change is possible. Growth is possible. The person you've been doesn't have to be the person you remain. Every day is a chance to choose kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment, courage over fear. As she spoke these final words, Tamika stood up from her seat and began to applaud. Within seconds, Jenna joined her, then Eli, then Mrs. Lockley, until the entire auditorium was on its feet in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. But what Sora would remember most wasn't the applause. It was the sight of Lila standing with the rest, tears streaming down her face, clapping not just for Sora's words, but for the possibility of becoming someone better than who she'd been. Later, as the auditorium emptied and students moved toward their final classes of the day, Sora found herself surrounded by classmates who wanted to thank her, to share their own stories, to ask about joining the self-defense club or the poetry group. She listened to each one with the same careful attention she'd once reserved for avoiding conflict, but now she was present by choice rather than necessity. Eli approached with his camera bag and a grin that threatened to split his face in half. "So," he said, "ready to change the world?" Sora looked around at the faces surrounding her, students who had found the courage to speak their truth, teachers who had been inspired to create safer spaces, former enemies who had become unlikely allies. She thought about the emails they'd received from students at other schools who had watched the video and started their own advocacy groups. She thought about her mother's photograph, cracked but not broken, beautiful in its imperfection. "I think," she said with a smile that held all the warmth and confidence she discovered within herself, "we already have." As the afternoon sun streamed through the auditorium windows, casting golden light across the stage where she'd just declared herself to the world, Sora Kim felt the last of her walls crumble away. She was no longer the invisible girl hiding in oversized hoodies, no longer the victim of other people's cruelty, no longer afraid of taking up space in the world. She was exactly who she was meant to be, strong enough to protect herself, wise enough to forgive her enemies, and brave enough to use her voice to lift others up. She was visible, valuable, and completely, unapologetically herself, and that, she realized, was the most powerful kind of strength of all. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.